Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. It's a joy to have you all with us. My name is Jay Harvey. I'm an assistant professor and executive director at Reformed Theological Seminary here in New York City. I am joined today by a number of co-hosts and, of course, our guest, Christopher Watkin. First, we have Grace Sutanto, who teaches systematic theology at Reformed Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. We're joined also by Mark McDowell, who is the executive director and also teaches systematic theology at RTS in Dallas. And Mark also teaches a class on political theology, which is robust. So we're glad they're going to co-host this event with me. And we're so thankful to have Dr. Christopher Watkin. Chris is a senior lecturer at Monash University in Australia. He has a forthcoming book of which you're aware. That's why you're here, Biblical Critical Theory. And that book is soon to be released. Actually, it has been released by now, Chris. Is that right?
I think it releases officially on the 8th.
On the 8th. You can purchase that for the best price, I'm told, at WTS Books. And so that's a place that Zondervan has directed us to direct you to purchase that book. And Chris is going to be with us in New York. He's going to be teaching a class from, January 19th to 21st, Christian Cultural and Social Theory. He's going to be teaching that course here in the city for us. We're going to have a forum, which is sort of a mini conference over several hours on Saturday, January 14th. You'll get more information about how you can register for that if you want to come to the city. He's going to do a number of events in the city. He's also going to be our graduation speaker, which our students are excited about on the 13th. You'll note that Tim is not here. Tim sends his regrets. He had a scheduling change, no problems, but he had a schedule change he could not adjust. So he sends his regrets to not be able to be with us. His foreword for the book was published on Gospel Coalition's website, I think yesterday. And so welcome to you. I want to thank our registrants for coming. Thank you for Zondervan for letting folks know about this as well. So let's just jump right in. Chris, thank you for being here. I want to just lead off with this question, and we'll see where our conversation goes. But John Milbank has spoken of social theory. Of course, he famously wrote a book, Theology and Social Theory, basically making the point that there was a basic incompatibility with theology and social theory as popularly conceived. Social theory more interested in desacralization and kind of a humanist account, naturalist account, and theology, Christianity specifically, obviously antithetical to that. What do you mean when you speak of social theory, and what resources do the Bible have for us?
Yeah, thank you, Jay. Just first of all, Jay, Gray, Mark, it's such a privilege for me to share this time with you. Thank you for engaging about the book. Thank you to everyone who's here. It's really humbling. And I really pray that this time will be a blessing to you all, that we'll be able to say things that will be encouraging. Let me try and start doing that now. I think it's helpful to think about social theory in terms of what it's trying to achieve and the moves that it makes. And I think there are three such moves that all social theories are doing in different ways. They're trying to make certain things in the world viable, in the sense that they're believable, they're thinkable. They're trying to make certain things in the world visible, that you notice them, that you become sensitive to them. And they're trying to make certain things in the world valuable. They teach you what to desire and what to condemn. Viable, visible, and valuable. And all social theories will do this in different ways. They'll draw your attention to different things in the world. Some will draw your attention to class inequalities, for example. And so, when you're looking at a particular piece of art, that'll be the sensitivity that you bring to it. And I think looking at it that way has the great advantage that it creates a canvas on which the Bible can also paint, doesn't it? Because the Bible also makes certain things viable. So, for example, trusting God's promises. You might think, have you not read the Bible, that's a ridiculous thing and an impossible thing. You couldn't imagine how that would work. But you read the Bible and you say, okay, I can see how this God can be trusted. That becomes something that's possible. The Bible makes certain things in the world visible. So, for example, the glory of God in creation, you may never have thought about it. You read the Bible and think, hey, the heavens declare the glory of God. That's really interesting. And it makes things like, the plight of widows and orphans in society visible as well, that we might not have noticed before. And it makes certain things valuable. Like, you may never have thought that God's name is something to be cherished if you hadn't read the Bible. And, you're reading and think, wow, this is a really important, valuable thing. And so the Bible is also doing this same thing that social theories are doing. It's doing it differently. It's not the same things that are made visible and valuable all the time, although there is some overlap. But I think looking at social theories that way allows the Bible to be part of that conversation without having to pretend that the Bible is anything other than it is. You don't have to shoehorn the Bible into that grid in order for it to speak in those categories.
Very helpful. Viable, visible, valuable. Very helpful. Mark?
Hi, Chris. Having read most of this work, not all of it, but most of it, I want to just applaud you for how wide-ranging it is. The analysis is penetrating, and you're drawing together a whole host of different threads. You're doing historical analysis, biblical interpretation, you're engaging social theory, cultural theory, and I think it would be helpful for you just to reflect, even just for a few moments, on the style and genre of this particular kind of theological work and what it is that you're trying to accomplish. So 2 things in that question. How would you define the genre of your project? And then what are you trying to accomplish with this particular kind of theological work?
It's a really helpful question, Mark. It's a tricky one to answer, isn't it? I think the genre would be something like a biblical theology of culture, in the sense that the book starts off in Genesis and it goes right through the Bible and finishes up at the end of Revelation. And it tries to read modern and contemporary, predominantly Western culture through that lens. So how do all the different key turning points in the biblical narrative shape a biblical approach to culture? If you want a pattern that it's trying to follow, if you like a great blazing sun that it's trying to hold a little candle up to, it would be Augustine's City of God, because that's what he does, isn't it? In the second half of the City of God, he tells the whole story, right from Genesis through to the consummation of the 2 cities. And he does so in the context, in the first half of the book, of trying to understand all the different nuances and parts of late Roman culture as well. And so what Augustine splits apart, so first half of the City of God, how does Rome think and act? What is Rome? Second half of the City of God, tell the Bible story. What I've tried to do is bring those together and sort of move between telling the story of modernity and the story of the Bible in each chapter. So rather than separating those 2, just doing them together. And so it's an attempt to read culture and cultures through the lens of the Bible. So if the Bible were to be the heart of a social and cultural theory, what might that social and cultural theory look like?
I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I think the parallel with Augustine's City of God is really apt, isn't it? I mean, in a lot of ways, Augustine was trying to deploy an immanent critique of the Roman world around him. And I think what Augustine was trying to do is that there is, first of all, it's standing on shaky ground, but secondly, it's also showing what I would say is the inescapability of Christianity, right? And I would argue that this Augustinian sort of impulse of showing that Christian faith is the inescapable foundation and telos of reality is an impulse that drives what I would call is the neo-Calvinist tradition that you're drawing from in a lot of ways too from this book, right? And if you read biblical critical theory, you're going to see lots of references to Herman Bavinck, lots of references to Kuyper and Cornelius Van Til, and these figures, especially as they are received in the American reform world, oftentimes has tended towards a sort of conflating or a mistaking of neo-Calvinism with, let's say, biblicism. So this idea that we have to use a Christian worldview or we have to use the Bible to interpret culture has led not so much to how they originally used it, so like a bobbing and a Kuiper, but actually it's used, wielded almost like a weapon, right? Let's use the Bible against culture. Let's use biblical proof texts as a means of showing that we have the Christian worldview and the culture doesn't, which is not a very Augustinian or even Babinkian impulse. I think when I think about the Neo-Calvinist tradition, it's that sense of, even while the modern culture is in a lot of ways against the Christian faith, we can't help but see Christian ideas in modern culture. Historically, it's dependent on the Bible and so forth. And but of course, because we're made in the image of God, modern culture is still exposed to Christian truths, whether they acknowledge it or not, right? So can you talk about how this Augustinian impulse has informed you through the Neo-Calvinist tradition? And also, what does it mean, therefore, to be biblical in this sort of tradition?
Yes, thank you. Can I just pick up something that you mentioned in the question, and then come straight to your question after that. You mentioned that what Augustine is doing is an immanent critique, which, for those not familiar with that technical term, is the idea that he's inhabiting a particular position to look at its inner tensions, rather than bringing some framework from the outside to it. He's trying to dismantle it from the inside. I think that's really helpful, but I think he's doing a bit more than that. And this is why Augustine's position in the city of God is just so brilliant, because he is absolutely, and this is where you're 100% right, Gray, he's an insider to Roman culture. You know, he's taught rhetoric in Carthage and Rome. He knows his Cicero. He knows all the Roman gods that nobody else has ever heard of, as well as the well-known ones. You know, he's very familiar with the way that culture understands the world, what it values, and he can dismantle it from the inside expertly. He's got some hilarious passages where he just looks at Roman culture and says, how on earth can these two things be true? How can you believe both these things? But I think that the power of the critique of the city of God comes from the fact that he's also a resolute outsider to this culture. Like, he can't fully assimilate to it. And, you know, there are biographical reasons. He's North African. He's not Roman in that sense. His mother's a Christian, his father's a pagan. But I think that the main reason that he always finds himself as an outsider is simply that he's inhabiting the biblical storyline, and he can't assimilate that to Rome. And that gives him such an oblique, sort of askance view of Roman culture. He's able to look at it with the eyes of an outsider, as if he's some, you know, sort of cultural anthropologist coming to Rome and doing a field study on these bizarre people called the Romans. And it's that combination of being utterly familiar with the culture and being able to appreciate it. You know, Cicero is a really good writer, and Augustine says so in the City of God. You know, he knows the greatness of Rome, so to speak, but also seeing it with the eyes of an outsider, that just makes his standpoint of cultural critique just brilliant. To come back now, so I've answered the question you didn't ask. Let me now answer the question that you most graciously did ask, which was about the neo-Calvinists and what does it mean to be biblical, which is a brilliant question. I think it gets to the heart of a lot of what the book is trying to do. I don't have a fancy pants answer, in the sense that I don't think it's that complicated, fundamentally, to begin with, at least. I think being biblical in the way that I try to do in the book means reading the Bible really carefully and trying to shape one's engagement with culture around biblical patterns. And in the book, I talk about these biblical patterns using the term figures. And that I mean by that is that the Bible has certain characteristic moves, certain signature ideas that keep coming up again and again in the Bible, and that shape the way that the Bible, so to speak, views reality. I guess the biggest one is this whole overarching framework of creation, fall, redemption, and consummation, which has huge implications for everything, you know, for politics, for society, for human beings. The fact that the world as it is now is not as it was originally created, nor as it will eventually be when it's redeemed. And that framework, that biblical way of understanding reality, I think shapes, and Herman Doiviert, of course, is wonderful on this. It shapes the way that a Christian approaches all of culture. And then there are also these repeated ideas in culture that, in the Bible, sorry, that just come again and again and shape a distinctively biblical approach to the whole of life. So one of them, of course, will be grace. You know, from Adam through Noah, David, and of course, supremely in Christ, there's the idea of God reaching down and doing for people what people can't do for themselves, but the primacy, I guess, of the gift as a way that we relate to God. Again, just shapes the whole of reality for Christians. Another one would be this wonderful idea in the Bible of what theologians have called the great reversal, how God has this delicious habit of upending people's expectations of power and privilege, you know. So he chooses Jacob, the younger son. Like, that's just not how society works in those days. It's the elder son who inherits. He chooses David, again, the shepherd boy. You know, I guess a modern equivalent would be, you know, he's the guy who comes around and empties the trash cans and empties the bins. He's not the sort of person you would choose to be a king. The Magnificat with Mary, you know, God reversing expectations again in that beautiful song of hers, and supremely with Christ, you know, the Nazarene carpenter, who is also the second person of the Trinity, and the one who dies on the cross to save all those who believe in him. This idea of reversing expectations in society, again, it's not something that just happens once in the Bible. It's something that becomes, through its repeated use, a distinctively biblical way of engaging with the world. And so as you read through the Bible, you keep your eyes open for these themes, these moves, these figures that keep coming back over and over again. And then you try and build a cultural theory around these biblically distinctive ways of engaging with reality. And that's what I mean by being biblical.
Chris, let me just jump in here and ask a question. You really do privilege and have a high place for scripture. And that's one of the things that was really encouraging about this, that does have so much of a resonance with Augustine's city of God, is that the Bible just threads through entirely. So you're bringing the Bible, Holy Scripture, to bear on cultural trajectories, philosophies, worldviews, and you employ this tool called diagonalization. And I think it would be helpful for those of us in the room, the virtual room, to hear from you what you mean by that and how you put that to work in kind of unmasking some of the philosophies that, you know, percolating to the surface in our culture that you say in your work that catechize us from a very young and tender age, which sometimes we're not even aware of these things, and how you use this tool, which you bring from scripture, to really confront these ideologies. I think that would be helpful for us.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. It's a big word for a concept that I don't think is that new to Christian thinking or really that strange. I think it's what the Bible is doing again and again, and what Christians, you know, throughout the 2000 years of the church have been showing that the Bible is doing. And in the book, I've got a big list of people who use this thing that I'm calling diagonalization, just to put a label on it so we can recognize it. It's the idea that the Bible has a rich and complex view of God and reality that holds together in a beautiful harmony a lot of things that secular culture throughout the centuries, and I think particularly modern culture, tries to pull apart and to oppose to each other. One example of that would be the biblical idea that we're created in the image of God. And that both ennobles us because we're created in the image of God and, you know, of everything in the whole of creation, only human beings are created in the image of God. That's a huge dignity, but it also humbles us because we're created in the image of God. You know, we are not God. There is only one God, and He's not us. And so there's a beautiful combination there of a great dignity and also a humbling. And what modernity does, I think, is that it has two opposing views of human beings that sit really awkwardly alongside each other. You know, G.K. Chesterton has a wonderful passage on this in Orthodoxy, and Blaise Pascal is really good on it as well. That there's one view of humans that makes us into our own little deities, if you like, and suggests that we can shape reality around our own view of it. Reality should conform to our sense of what it should be. Our desires should be fulfilled for whatever it is. And there's a deification of humanity, a putting humanity in the place of sovereignty that is customarily occupied by God. But there's also another view of human beings in the modern world, which is to, if you like, reduce our dignity and to say fundamentally and in every way that matters, there is no difference, qualitative difference between humans and, say, animals, or humans and, say, machines. You know, Thomas Hobbes is really vivid on this in the opening paragraphs of Leviathan. We are springs and pulleys and wheels, he says. That's it. And what this is doing is it's taking these two aspects of the image of God that the Bible holds beautifully together. It's pulling them apart and opposing them to each other. So you're either a God or you're a machine. And that's just really uncomfortable and really damaging, actually, isn't it? As a position to have to try and conjure with. You know, try and make sense of that. You know, you are a God and you are a machine. That is not going to end well for your view of yourself. And what diagonalization does is it says these two things that we've ripped apart and that we've opposed to each other originally weren't ripped apart. They're part of a bigger whole. And if you go back to the Bible, you see that being in the image of God has elements to both of these, but they've been dismembered, they've been exaggerated, and they've been opposed to each other. So to diagonalize that difference is just to say, hey, look, you don't need to oppose them in this way. And your opposition is derivative of a beautiful harmony in the Bible. So let's just go back to the original harmony. And then we don't have this terrible violent tension between these two poles of the dualism that you've manufactured out of the biblical whole. And so and I'm aware that I'm going on a bit, let me make this the last sentence. And so some people would say that, diagonalization is always trying to just split the difference between the different oppositions in society and have some wishy-washy sort of halfway house. No. It's actually trying to say the opposition is originally in itself derivative. Like, don't start with the opposition, start with the beautiful biblical harmony that the opposition is a bad photocopy of to start with. And so it's not in that sense, and again, it's been called in a disparaging sense, some sort of third way position. It's actually the first way. God comes up with a beautiful harmony first, and then we rip it apart and oppose different bits of it to each other. So it's a restoring of reality rather than some sort of, let's have half of this side and half of the other side and meet in the middle.
Chris, you mentioned the figures, which is a delightful part of this book, and wonder if you could comment on two things there. Some of your own thinking, how you arrived at the concept of figures, some of the people who influenced you there, and then what the parameters are in discovering and developing a biblical figure. What would be, how would we declare this a figure, but maybe this a theme or something less than a figure as it functions in your system?
Yeah, thank you. I think the idea of figures came out of, I suppose it was a frustration that different Christian thinkers tended to privilege one way of engaging with the world and to think that it's upstream of all the others. And so some people would write as if the only thing that shapes us is ideas. And everything is, first of all, a concept. And then downstream of that, you've got behaviors and rituals and so forth. And other people would turn that on its head and say, no, everything is, first of all, a habit or a behavior. And then concepts sort of crystallize out of that, and they're downstream. And others would say, no, actually, we're most shaped by artifacts and the built environment around us. And I'd read all of these people and I'd think, well, look, I agree with you to a certain extent, to the point at which you say this one thing is what shapes us most fundamentally, and everything else is derivative of it, because it just seems to me that it's more complex than that. We are shaped by the artifacts around us. We are shaped by ideas, absolutely. And we are shaped by our habits, and precisely how those relate to each other, I think is more complex than just saying one of those controls all the others. And so I tried to think, how can you allow for that richness of the relationship between these things? And figures was a way of coming up with that. So there are different categories of figures. One is absolutely the ideas and the words that we use, which shape our view of reality. One is the habits and behaviors that we engage in that similarly push us towards a particular view of the world. Then there's the artifacts, the stuff, the material around us, everything from our iPhones to our chairs to the built environment, the way that buildings are set out. All of this is important to take into account. And it was a way of trying to take all these things into account without having one of them artificially dominate all the others. And I think there was a second half, Jay, to your question, which I forget now.
What are the parameters in isolating something that's a biblical figure? Obviously, it arises out of exegesis, biblical theology from there, but just what parameters declare something a figure as opposed to something less than that in terms of its utility?
Yeah, I like the idea of declaring something a figure. Like, we find
you've declared like 6 or 7.
This thing.
It's declared a figure.
Officially a figure, I hereby declare. There's no hard and fast rule. Like, there's no quantitative threshold that you have to get over in order to officially be baptized as a figure. It's a way of talking about themes, I guess, or even ways of engaging with reality in the Bible that keep coming back again and again. And so I think it's probably in a way that sort of Wittgenstein would use. It's probably easier to talk about it by giving examples than it is by saying these are the 3 things that something must be in order to be a figure. So, for example, the idea of God's lavishness and God's superabundance, it's there in creation. It's even there in the fall, where he's really kind to Adam and Eve, making clothes for them, making promises for them, even in the moment where he's expelling them from the garden. And my goodness, it's there in redemption as well, in all the how much more passages in Paul and sort of many of Jesus's parables. And so something like that, where you see it throughout the Bible, that God is lavish, God is giving in a way that is above and beyond what could legitimately be expected. It's at that point that you say, okay, this is something that the Bible is consistently doing, a way it's consistently engaging with reality. And then the label figure just helps to make that visible. I guess there's nothing magical about calling something a figure. It's just a way that the Bible customarily engages with reality, and giving it the label figure just helps us to see it and then to make use of it.
So it needs to occur more than once. I mean, if it's going to be family resemblances, there needs to be more than one member of the family, right? There has to be,
yes.
From Genesis to Revelation, something should be recurring as a theme more than one, if it's going to have this relevant figure in Christian theology.
It's an extended family. It's not a nuclear family.
It's not a nuclear family. It's not even a nuclear family. It's an extended family. We have some great audience questions that I think also Gray and Mark we're going to turn to. So the link in the chat, if you haven't discovered that, that's with Slido. And it's nice because you can post a question and then your colleagues online can vote it up. And so you can see what the market demand is for the question. And just to go into one of these questions, I'm tempted to skip. I'm going to be disciplined and go with Slido because there's one on political theology that we were going to enter into. But let's start with the question that's been voted up the most. Are there thinkers who are doing other similar projects, biblical theology of culture, in non-Western cultures? Now, before we address this, Yusta Gonzalez has a great book on Augustine, and he sort of challenges us to see Augustine as not quite a Western thinker. His mestizo theology, he's on the margins of the empire. There's different influences culturally for Augustine. So just to put that out there, because we talked about Augustine. But yeah, do you have any thoughts on or knowledge of non-Western projects similar to this?
My own training and area of expertise is in French and European philosophy. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to disappoint the questioner and say, I'm sure that there is wonderful work going on. I am not the person to introduce you to that work, I'm afraid. I have quite a limited competence myself, but I'm sure that there's wonderful stuff being done. I just don't personally know about it.
You do take account of some non-Western voices. I'm sorry, Gray. You take account of some non-Western voices, I think, in your work, in your own account, right? I know we've spoken about Charles Mills, who's recently deceased, from the Graduate Center of the Racial Contract people. I mean, I think you're listening for those voices in your account, as I recall, somewhat.
Yes, absolutely. I took the question mainly to be meaning theologians and
yes, I think that's correct. I think the
Yes.
question was asking who's doing what you're doing in a non-Western context, and you said, I'm not sure about that. But I was just adding my engagement with you, and one of the things I appreciate about you is that you have taken account of voices other than your own tradition or your own lineage.
Yeah, if I could jump in on the question. So yeah, Chris's training is in French philosophy, but there are definitely a lot of work dealing with the non-Western or sort of global context. I would mention the edited volume by Matthew Kamink called Reformed Public Theology, Global Vision for Life in the World. It's got lots of wonderful chapters from South African theologians. I've got a chapter in there on religious pluralism in Indonesia. Romel Bagaris is a wonderful neo-Calvinist Filipino public theologian, political theorist, and so on. So there's lots of figures that are represented there that represent the global majority report in terms of the Reformed tradition. And I would say, though, that ultimately at the end of the day, right, Western, non-Western, we all have common human nature, so we could definitely learn from each other continually. So,
well, I know of an Indonesian theologian who's working on a book on anthropology.
Yeah, I wonder who that might be.
So, great. Just comment a minute from an Indonesian perspective. We've talked about this for what is assumed to be Western versus what is not assumed to be. The way Western is used. Right. Just share your perspective on that. I know that's come up in our conversation and with students before.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I do think that, ironically, the idea of dividing up the world from Western to non-Western is a very Western construct. Usually, when people think of that way, they've already imbibed in the Western paradigm that there is ultimately irreconcilable differences. And if you take a look at, so the discipline of anthropology, if you read Matthew Engelke's How to Think Like an Anthropologist, in that particular work, the discipline of anthropology actually came out as a result of the colonial travels of particular Western thinkers. And because they have a very low view of the image of God, I would suggest, or at least a distorted view of the image of God in some of these thinkers, they went about traveling in these expeditions, and they were observing how different these cultures are, how exotic they are, how Oriental they were, or whatever else, right? So, and this is fundamentally actually challenged by someone like Herman Bavinck. Bavinck wrote, and this is a neglected part of Bavinck's corpus, Philosophy of Revelation, the last couple of chapters, and also the chapter on history and culture. Bavinck actually argued that in the 19th century, there was this dividing up of humanity. And when you take a look at peoples of a different place, it's almost like you're stepping into a time machine. These were us, sure, but they're us like from back then. They're the primitive people, and they have the primitive religion. We have the Western culture. We have the most evolved sort of religion. So that sort of perspective presupposes a kind of social Darwinism with respect to human beings, and sees therefore the contributions of the non-West world as the other that we can listen from, right? And Bavinck ultimately says, sure, there might be differences, but the commonality underneath the differences greatly outweigh the differences. That even if you're taking a look at a very different people, there's still culture there because people are made in the image of God. So I think we would just point that out. And usually what I try to say to folks, you know, especially in an American context, I think we can say this. People say, oh, you know, the Christian worldview is just the Western worldview. But that's not how people in Asia take a look at it. It's not Christianity that's the Western worldview, because Christianity is viewed in Asia as having a lot of point of contact with sexual ethics and so on. But really, usually what they think of as the Western perspective is not Christian faith. I would just mention it that way.
Yep. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. That was a long way of answering. So go ahead, Mark.
It's fine, Gray. Chris, I wanted to turn to the topic of political theology. It's a big week next week in the United States, and as an expat myself, I get to watch it from a distance of sorts. But Douglas Farrow has said that any theologian will eventually have to do political theology, and you definitely touch on it in this work. And I would be fascinated to hear how you could help us with this distinction that you make between progressivism and conservatism, how you apply the biblical metaphor of exile to that, drawing from 1 Peter 1. And just reflecting on, there's a comment that you make that sometimes the right and the left look very similar to each other. They trade off the same kind of political and economic heritages, and ironically so. And so it'd be great just to hear a Brit reflect on that situation, politically speaking.
Thank you, I think, Mark, for that question. I preface everything I say by the very obvious fact that I'm an outsider to US politics. I don't understand it intimately, and therefore that may allow me to see things that people inside it sometimes miss, but it also means that I may miss things. So I read a really interesting book a few months ago by a cognitive linguist called George Lakoff, who's himself, you know, quite on the left of the political spectrum. And he's saying that the political divide isn't really a divide over policy as much as this a divide over a fundamental view of the world and the values that come out of that. And he says that what we call the liberal and the conservative sort of wings of politics are really two different views of authority. And he calls one of them the strict father morality, and he says that's part of the way that the right wing sees the world, and that the key values are things like security, merit, and morality as strength. And then he says that on the left you've got what he calls a nurturing parent morality, which is big on ideas of fairness and empathy and growth. And then in the book, really interestingly, he has this passage where he talks about the Bible. And he says both of these features, both of these dispositions are there in the biblical God. There is authority and strictness, and there is grace and nurturing. And I think what he's helping us to see there is that, once more, what's happened is that, politically speaking, we've dismembered the character of God to some extent, and we've opposed different aspects of God's character to each other, and we've forced a choice between them. So you can either choose grace and nurture on the one hand, which is for Lakoff this fundamental values underlying the policies of the left. So it's not a policy debate, it's a dispositional debate between the two sides. Or you can opt for the authority, the strictness, and the merit that he identifies with the right. And the tragedy of that situation, I think, is the forcing of the choice. Because we would all say, all Christians who've read our Bibles, that the authority of God is really important, and the fact that he says, clearly how people are to live is not an unfortunate bug in the Bible. It's a feature of the Bible. To know his character and to reflect that in the way that we live is a good thing. But also that God's grace isn't a bug either. That's a wonderful feature. And also, again, that these two things are not in tension with each other in the Bible. Like, it's not that, God is some sort of, I don't know, schizophrenic with his hard authoritarian side and then his, fuzzy grandfather side. There's a beautiful harmony between these things. And so to the extent that in our culture, each side of the political spectrum reflects part of what God is, and therefore forces us to choose between two aspects of what God is, I think is the real tragedy of the political situation in which we, and I include the UK and Australia as well, the post-French Revolution political system with left and right. That's the tragedy in which we find ourselves. And I think that the way that the Christian can speak into that a word of peace, but also, a word that has bite to it, not just saying, let's all get along with each other, let's all be friends, but can speak a robust but ironic word into that, is to say, if you find yourself able to look beyond these dismembered limbs of the biblical God and stop thinking that what you have to do is choose either one or the other of them, and therefore oppose yourself to the one you've not chosen and define yourself as having rejected that. If you're able to look beyond that, you can actually see a more wholesome and rich and dynamic and complex view of what society could be and what politics could be, that challenges both left and right, that again doesn't split the difference. I'm not suggesting that half of the policies on the left are right and half of the policies on that. That's a dumbing down of this position. I think what it is looking beyond that and seeing how the aspirations of both the left and the right, of both liberals and progressives, at this fundamental level that Lakoff is getting at. So your baseline view of the world that informs your policies, how both those sets of aspirations are both transformed and fulfilled in the biblical God. And the transformed is key. So it's not that there's a straight line between what progressives think they want and what the Bible says God is, and there's no straight line between what conservatives think they want and what the Bible says there is. Both of these agendas are transformed at the cross, as Paul would say in 1 Corinthians 1, of Greek wisdom and Jewish signs. They're upended, but they are also, as he also says in 1 Corinthians 1, fulfilled. So I think that's the way that you'd want to, I think, articulate how the Bible diagonalizes the political dichotomy that we find ourselves stuck in today.
Thanks for that, Chris. I really appreciated also the emphasis that you place on virtue. And one of those virtues that you mentioned, which I gather you take from Lewis, is this idea of listening well to the other side, and how that is truly a Christian virtue, that we've almost arrived at a place where we put the earmuffs on, culturally speaking, politically speaking, and that actually has a deleterious effect on ourselves and on the church. And I'd be curious to know what you think about the ways in which we could cultivate that virtue with a little bit more widespread effect. I think you used the Latin as audi alterum partem is Lewis's phrase, which I think has got so much cash value to it as well. But I'd love to know what you think about how we could, as Christians and as the church, help to cultivate that virtue a little bit more.
Yeah. What a wonderful question. Thank you. I think this is right at the heart of Christian ethics and sort of the way that Christians engage with reality. It's a version of the golden rule, I think. Read others as you'd wish them to read you. And if you don't like being misrepresented, which I'm not aware that any of us does, then try your level best not to misrepresent anyone else. The aude altra partem thing is literally listen to the other side. And I think it's got two aspects to it. One of which I think Christians can be quite good at. And the other one, perhaps Christians and others are not quite so good at. The first part is understanding the other person's position, being able to articulate it in a way that the other person says, yes, that is what I believe. You have spoken about it in a way that I am happy to own. And I think Christians sometimes can do that quite well, understanding the logic of another position and so forth. But I think it's more than that, because it also, in order really to understand a position, you've got to know why it's so attractive to the person who holds it, not simply why they think it's true, but why they think it's worth their while to hold it, why they get out of bed in the morning wanting to tell people about this position that they have, and why in conversation they'll try and convince other people. And that's not just because something is true, it's because it sparkles for them, it's attractive, it makes them excited. And I think if we can understand both why something is true for someone and also why they get excited about it, then we're beginning really well to listen to the other side. And Christians, I think, ought to, and that verb is really sort of strategic, because this is not something that we often do and rarely do well. So I'm not suggesting that Christians are brilliant at this, but I think the resources that the Bible gives us ought to be making us good at being open to culture. And the reason for that is that Christians have a measure of what's good and what's evil. But that measure is not found within the created order. So as Jesus says, only God is good. So there's nothing within the created order, nothing that's been made that can serve as an absolute measure of what's good, because that's God alone. And similarly, there's nothing within the created order that is absolutely and unremittingly evil. No sort of cultural movement, no idea that we can look at and say there is absolutely nothing in any dark corner of this that is not some dim reflection of God's goodness. And that gives Christians an incredibly powerful disposition, an exciting disposition when we engage with culture, because whatever we look at, whether it's an idea or a movement or an artifact, Christians are predisposed to thinking there's got to be something here that's good, because nothing in creation is utterly and unremittingly evil. But there's also going to be something here that's problematic, that's not quite right, because only God is good. And that goes for everything from Christian churches and denominations, individual Christians, to movements in secular culture, to different genres of music and everything. There's nothing that's exempt from this complexity. And I think that means that Christians are really open. Not that Christians should be reading and listening to absolutely everything indiscriminately. That's again a dumbing down of this position. But it's that we can look at anything in culture and critique it with a subtlety that we'll expect to find complexities in it. Now, you compare that to views of the world that do have a measure of good and evil, but have to find those measures within the created order, at pain of not having any way of critiquing society at all. You've got to have some measure to be able to bring to society to say that things are not right. But if you find that within the created order, say you find it in the conflict between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, for example, or say if you find your measure of what is good and evil in the tussle between regulation and freedom, constraints and freedom within society, then there are some things within society that you're going to have a closed mind to. because those are the things that give you your measure of what's good and evil. And so there's going to be a dogmatism, a stubborn, inflexible dogmatism to particular aspects of culture. If you find your measure of what's good and evil within culture, you just can't avoid it. The only way you could avoid it is to have no measure of good and evil at all, which has its problems of its own. So that doesn't get you off the hook. The only position that can allow you to have a functioning ethics and to be able to say of some things in society, that's not right, and yet be open to engaging with all aspects of culture in a discerning way, is if you do have a measure of good and evil, but you find it outside the created order. And that's the position that Christians find themselves in.
So, Chris, I think a follow-up question to that. First of all, I mean, I completely agree with this. I think the sort of position that you're talking about is what others have called subversive fulfillment, critical dialogical pluralism, perhaps, right? How would you respond to someone who says that might be well and good in a culture that was, let's say, indifferent to Christianity, but we find increasing hostility, even more open antagonism against Christianity now? And so what we really need now is either, there's two responses to this, sort of an established Christian nation church model, or maybe even a different form of it, and just, fleeing from culture, separating ourselves, establishing a Christian community. Lots of the questioners are asking about how your book could implicate political theology and political theory, right? You've addressed that a little bit. So how would you articulate yourself against that sort of pushback, if that makes sense?
I would want to. So let's start with the position that says we need to flee from society and create a Christian community. That is sort of the caricature of the Rod Dreher position, isn't it? I think what that position has going for it is the recognition that Christians need to have a strong, thick culture and community from which we go out into the world. And if the local church and other parachurch organizations that are supporting the local church are not providing that thick, catechetical, formative, rich community that is feeding Christians on a number of different levels, not simply the intellectual, not simply you parachute in on a Sunday morning and then you parachute out. But if Christians are not being formed in a deep way by community, then I think that they're incredibly vulnerable to being catechized by the society, which is very vigorously and very effectively catechizing us every day. So you do need that really strong culture. But I think that position goes too far when it says that all that you need is that culture. You need then to shut the doors and try and preserve only that, because part of the problem is that if you shut the doors, the culture's already on the inside. We've all been catechized very effectively by late modern culture. And for us to be able to think that our assumptions can be completely sort of cut asunder from the way that late modernity thinks about the world, I think is a dangerously naive position that stops us being able to see the ways that we're being shaped. And if we don't acknowledge them, if we don't see that we are really quite deeply ourselves late moderns, then we're not able to address and assess the ways that the culture is shaping us. So to say, shut the doors of the church, flee from the culture, and the culture will be outside rather than inside, I think is naive and quite dangerous. And I guess the other extreme would be to say, Christians have nothing particularly distinctive to offer in the culture. We just need to be, part of the whole secular project that's going on and serve the world in that way. Just seems to serve sell the Bible really short, because I think, both in the Old Testament prophets, the wisdom literature, and in Jesus and Paul's teaching in the New Testament, there really is something very distinctive about a Christian community. Just to take one example, by this will all people know that you're my disciples, that you love one another. And there's a sense there that this love should be a distinctive sort of love. It shouldn't just be a warmed over version of what's going on in society. There should be something different about it. And I think you need both of those. You need a strong community that is forming people, And you also need then from that position to go out into the world in a Jeremiah 29 letter to the exiles sort of way, and work for the peace and prosperity of the city. And I don't think that recent changes in our culture are anything sort of qualitatively that Christians either haven't faced in the past or aren't facing in other parts of the world at the moment. Like, it's not that the game has suddenly fundamentally changed, and the Bible no longer equips us for this new reality in the way that it did. Life was pretty hard for Christians in the early centuries of the church, and life is extremely hard for Christians in many parts of the world today. And I think that the resources are all there, is what I'm saying. Like, we don't need to rethink everything from the ground up. And I think Augustine, again, gets this balance beautifully. He's out there in the world, but he's not assimilating to the world. He's richly and deeply and thickly formed in biblical ways of thinking and acting, but he doesn't need to flee to the hills in order to do that. He's engaging with the world, engaging with late Roman culture from that point of being deeply formed in a Christian community.
Chris, just to follow up with one other question that was put forward here and it's been voted up to the top. I might reframe it slightly, but the question is, how do you describe and biblically evaluate critical theory, either with respect to race or gender? How does your take differ from typical defenders or attackers? But if I could advance this and relate it to what you said about listening, caring, understanding the other side and the political situation that we're in now, in terms of methodologically, what do we learn or not learn from a standpoint epistemological position where the position of the knower becomes definitive for the horizon of their knowledge? What do we learn from that? What do we reject about that? Because I think in terms of methodology and your use of figures and motifs, that might get beneath the surface a little bit rather than just commenting generally on critical theorists. What and how does that help us in navigating dealing with people different than us in society?
Yeah, thank you, Jay. To the broader question to begin with, the passage that I find most helpful biblically, and that I keep coming back to again and again when this sort of issue, critical theory or something like that comes up, is 1 Corinthians 1, which I just think is a huge treasure trove of wisdom and ways of engaging biblically with different aspects of culture. And so really briefly, what Paul is doing is he identifies two things that are really important in the culture around him. The Greeks love wisdom. The Jews demand miraculous signs, which later in the passage he says is a desire for power, a manifestation of God's power. And he does two things. And it's the combination of the two that I think is just dynamite for Christian cultural critique. So first of all, he says that there's an absolute antithesis between these things and God. He says that the foolishness of the cross. Greeks, you look for wisdom. We preach a foolish Christ crucified. It's the absolute opposite of what you want. And he talks about God's weakness as well. Jews, you look for power. We preach God's weakness. And so there's a sense that the aspirations that you want fulfilled are completely confounded in the God of the Bible. And if that's all he said, then that would very much be a sort of a Christ against culture position. You want A, the Bible says Z. There's never the twain shall meet. But he doesn't do that. He doesn't just do that. He also shows how the Bible fulfills the Greek desire for wisdom and the Jewish demand for signs. He talks towards the end of that passage about God's foolishness is wiser than man's wisdom. And he talks about the wisdom of Christ. And what this leaves you with is a position where he's effectively saying to the Jews and Greeks, and I think I originally got this from Tim Keller, so I'm just sort of rehashing what he says about this, is that he's saying, I know that you want wisdom, and I know that you've got an understanding of what that is, but I'm going to set you a challenge. Are you committed to your search for wisdom so much that you are willing to try searching for it in the place where you would least expect to find it? In other words, on the foolishness of a criminal hanging on a cross, which, and we don't need to belabor this point, but in Roman culture, that is the unspeakable thing. That there is nothing more base or degraded or stupid than someone hanging on a cross. So he's saying, if you are willing to look at the last place you would ever think of looking for wisdom, you will find a transformation and a fullness of what you're looking for, the likes of which you have never imagined. So God's wisdom is not just a bit better version of what you think you're looking for. It is orders of magnitude greater than what you ever imagined was possible in terms of wisdom. And Paul's brilliance is that he holds antithesis, God is foolish, you want wisdom, and fulfillment, God's foolishness is wiser than your wisdom, together. And so that's the pattern that I want to try and bring to anything like critical theory. So there will be a hard antithesis between what the critical theorists are looking for and what the Bible offers. And if we can say, Greeks look for wisdom, Jews demand miraculous signs, what is critical theory after? Well, in many ways, it's justice. It's the sense of justice in society. We want just race relations. But the sense of justice that's being searched for, in the same way that the sense of wisdom that the Greeks are looking for, is a very small, a very impoverished sense of justice compared to what the Bible offers. And it needs to be both overturned through the cross and also fulfilled through the cross. And I think it's at the moment that you let go of either of those things, that you either loosen your grip on antithesis or you loosen your grip on fulfillment, that you've got a sub-biblical response to cultural movements like critical theory. And just one final sentence on this. I think the pathos of the Christian response to movements like critical theory is often that we do dichotomize those two things and we force a choice. So either you're going to invest yourself in the idea as a Christian that what critical race theory is after is fundamentally good, and you hitch Christianity to that wagon, and you say Christianity is perhaps just a sort of a bit better version of what you're after, but there's a linear continuity between what you want and what Christianity is. Okay, that's choice one. Or you say, choice two, there's an absolute antithesis between what CRT wants and what the Bible says. And so in order to be faithful to the Bible, what you have to do is systematically and repeatedly reject and condemn everything that critical race theory is trying to do. And so, you've got the people who say the Bible is the fulfillment of critical race theory, and you've got the people who say the Bible is the antithesis of critical race theory. And then what Paul does is he comes along and says both of those are inadequate, both of those are sub-biblical, because Christ is both, the cross is both foolish, it's an antithesis, and wiser than human wisdom. It's a fulfillment. And now it's hard to keep those two together. It takes a lot of thinking. You've got to get into the nitty-gritty and work out, how is critical race theory thinking about various issues. It's not a glib one-liner, but I think Paul does provide us with a really engaging, positive, constructive, powerful, subversive template for dealing with issues like that.
Thank you so much. Well, you've been generous with your time, Chris, and we would love to keep you here for another hour or so, but maybe we can reschedule for that. But we do have you coming here for 2.5 weeks in January, so I guess we do have that to look forward to. And we're just so thankful that you're here. This has been recorded, so we will likely make this available and follow up with those who were happy to sign on today. And thank you for signing on as well. So that'll be it for today. Gray, Mark, thank you. Chris, you'll have a good day, and the rest of us will have a good evening.
Wonderful. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your questions.
All right. Bye.